The sun was setting on what had been a perfectly normal Tuesday evening when Mrs. Thompson was driving home from her small boutique shop on Oak Street. The peaceful drive through her familiar neighborhood streets suddenly turned tense when flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. With a heavy sigh, she carefully pulled her Mercedes SUV to the side of the quiet suburban road, making sure to follow every proper procedure she'd learned over her years of driving. Through her mirror, she could see two officers approaching, one tall and heavyset, the other shorter with a rigid posture. Both wore dark sunglasses despite the dimming daylight. Strange, she thought to herself, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel as her father had always taught her. The boutique owner had just finished a successful day of sales, and her new luxury SUV was filled with paperwork and inventory records she needed for an important meeting the next morning. License and registration, the taller officer demanded without even a greeting, his tone unnecessarily harsh for what should have been a routine traffic stop. Mrs. Thompson kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents, all too aware of how these situations could escalate for people who looked like her. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she asked politely, maintaining her composure despite the officer's hostile demeanor. Her voice was steady, though her heart was beginning to race. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. "You ran that stop sign back there," the shorter officer cut in, pointing vaguely behind them. Mrs. Thompson felt her stomach tighten. She knew with absolute certainty that she'd made a complete stop at every sign. She'd been extra careful, as she always was in this neighborhood. "Sir, I respectfully disagree," she replied, keeping her tone professional and calm, just as she did when dealing with difficult customers at her store. "I came to a complete stop at every sign on my route." The officers exchanged a look that made Mrs. Thompson's skin crawl. Something about this stop felt different, felt wrong. She discreetly pressed the emergency recording button on her phone. Another habit her father had insisted she develop. The phone began silently documenting everything. "Step out of the vehicle," the taller officer ordered, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. The shorter one had already moved to the passenger side, peering intently through her tinted windows at the stacks of business paperwork on her seat. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced as she considered her options. As a business owner who regularly dealt with local law enforcement for permits and licenses, she knew her rights. But she also knew the reality of being a black woman alone at a traffic stop with two increasingly aggressive officers. With trembling fingers, she managed to send a quick text to her husband, a well-known civil rights attorney downtown. "Traffic stop on Cedar Lane. Something's wrong. Come quick." She made sure to share her location before carefully placing the phone in her pocket, the recording still running. The autumn air felt unusually cold as she stepped out of her Mercedes, the leather of her business heels clicking softly against the asphalt. The streets were empty, the neighboring houses quiet behind their manicured lawns. Only the harsh glare of the police cruiser's lights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows that seemed to dance ominously around them. Little did these officers know that their routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine, and their actions in the next few minutes would have consequences that would echo far beyond this quiet suburban street. The situation quickly took a dark turn as both officers circled Mrs. Thompson like wolves sizing up their prey. "What's in all these papers?" the taller officer demanded, pointing at the stack of documents visible through her car window. She took a deep breath before answering, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Those are business records from my boutique. I own a shop downtown," she explained calmly, maintaining eye contact. "I have all my business licenses and permits if you'd like to see them." But the officers seemed uninterested in her explanation. Instead, the shorter one was already pulling at her car's door handle without permission. "We're going to need to search this vehicle," he announced, not asked. Mrs. Thompson felt her professional demeanor starting to crack. Years of building her business from scratch, of earning respect in the community, and here she was, being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. "I do not consent to a search," she stated firmly, remembering her husband's legal advice. "You pulled me over for allegedly running a stop sign. There's no probable cause for a vehicle search." The words had barely left her mouth when the taller officer stepped uncomfortably close, towering over her. "Ma'am, are you refusing to cooperate with law enforcement?" His voice dripped with fake politeness, but his eyes told a different story. The shorter officer had already opened her car door, rifling through her carefully organized paperwork. Sales reports and inventory lists scattered across the seat like fallen leaves. Mrs. Thompson felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word, every rustling paper, every abuse of power. She silently prayed her husband would arrive soon. "I know my rights," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is an illegal search, and you know it." The taller officer's fake smile disappeared completely. He grabbed her arm, spinning her away from the car. She stumbled in her heels, but managed to keep her balance. "Stand over there," he barked, pointing to the police cruiser, "and keep your hands where I can see them." Mrs. Thompson complied, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. From her new position, she watched helplessly as they tore through her Mercedes, throwing aside documents she'd spent hours organizing. The street remained eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. Some slowed down to look, but none stopped. Mrs. Thompson felt incredibly alone, standing in the harsh glare of the police lights. She thought about her daughter at home, probably wondering why Mommy was late for dinner. She thought about her boutique, about all her employees who depended on her. She couldn't let these officers destroy everything she'd worked so hard to build. Suddenly, the shorter officer emerged from the passenger side with a triumphant look on his face. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he said, holding up her business ledger like it was evidence of some terrible crime. Mrs. Thompson watched in disbelief as he began flipping through the pages, completely disregarding the private financial information contained within. "That's confidential business information," she protested, taking an instinctive step forward. The taller officer immediately put his hand on his weapon, making her freeze in place. The message was clear: stay where you are, or else. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made both officers pause. Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of hope, but it wasn't over yet. As the shorter officer ducked back into her car, she noticed him reaching underneath the driver's seat with something in his hand. Her eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen, but she was powerless to stop it. The next few moments would change everything, and not even these power-drunk officers could predict the storm that was about to break over their heads. The approaching sirens grew louder, mixing with the quiet hum of the police cruiser's idle engine. Mrs. Thompson felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. Her husband had replied. She couldn't check it, but knowing help was on the way gave her strength. The shorter officer was still inside her car, and something about his movements made her increasingly uneasy. "I smell gasoline," the taller officer suddenly announced, his voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. That was impossible. She just had her car serviced last week, and everything was perfect. She knew exactly what they were trying to do. "That's not possible," she said firmly, her business owner's confidence shining through despite her fear. "I have maintenance records to prove my car was just checked. Everything's in perfect order." She gestured toward the scattered papers in her car, which included the recent service receipt. The shorter officer emerged from her Mercedes, brushing his hands on his pants in a way that made her stomach turn. "Ma'am, step further back from the vehicle," he ordered, exchanging a meaningful look with his partner. Mrs. Thompson noticed a small dark stain on his sleeve that hadn't been there before. More sirens joined the first, getting closer by the second. The officers seemed to be working faster now, their movements more hurried. The taller one kept glancing down the street, while his partner circled to the driver's side of her car again. "This is about more than a stop sign, isn't it?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You're targeting me because I'm a successful black business owner in this neighborhood." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with truth. The taller officer's face darkened. "Watch your accusations, ma'am," he growled, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice now. He knew they were being recorded, both by her phone and their own body cameras. His partner had stopped moving, caught off guard by her direct challenge. Headlights appeared at the end of the street, not police lights, but a familiar black SUV that made both officers straighten up. Mrs. Thompson allowed herself a small smile. Her husband wasn't coming alone. She recognized the local news van following close behind him. "Is there a problem here?" the shorter officer asked, suddenly all professional courtesy. The change in his tone was almost laughable. "We're just conducting a routine traffic stop." But Mrs. Thompson could see sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger now, and Mrs. Thompson's trained eye caught a small dark puddle forming under her car. Her years of business experience had taught her to notice details, to spot things others might miss. She pulled out her phone, openly recording now. "You planted that gas," she stated clearly, making sure her phone captured every word. "I'm recording everything, and I want both of your badge numbers." The officers exchanged panicked looks as multiple vehicles began pulling up to the scene. Her husband's SUV stopped first, and she could see he wasn't alone. Another civil rights attorney was with him, along with a reporter she recognized from the local news. The story of a successful black businesswoman being harassed by police would make headlines, and these officers knew it. But before anyone could exit their vehicles, a small orange glow caught Mrs. Thompson's eye. It was coming from under her car, where the gas had been leaking. Her heart stopped as she realized what was about to happen. The officers saw it too, and their faces went pale. "Everyone back," she shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to taking charge. The next few seconds would change everything, not just for her, but for every person of color who'd ever been wrongfully targeted by those sworn to protect and serve. The first flames licked up from beneath Mrs. Thompson's Mercedes, small at first, but growing quickly. Her heart sank as she watched years of hard work, documented in papers and files now trapped inside, about to go up in smoke. The fire cast an eerie orange glow across the darkening street, reflecting off the officers' now pale faces. "Stay back," her husband shouted from his SUV, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years in courtrooms. The news crew was already setting up their camera, capturing everything. The two officers who had caused this mess stood frozen, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. Mrs. Thompson watched in horror as the flames grew higher. "My business records," she cried out, taking an instinctive step forward. "Everything I need for the tax audit is in there." Her husband caught her arm, holding her back from the increasingly dangerous scene. The heat was intense now, warming their faces even from a safe distance. The local news reporter, a woman known for her tough questioning of authority, was already live on scene. "We're here at what appears to be a routine traffic stop gone horribly wrong," she announced into her microphone, her camera operator capturing every detail of the unfolding chaos. The taller officer suddenly found his voice. "We need to secure the scene," he announced weakly, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. More cars were pulling up, drawn by the commotion and the growing flames. Neighbors emerged from their homes, cell phones raised to record everything. "You mean the scene you created?" Mrs. Thompson's husband challenged, his legal training evident in every word. "The scene where you deliberately planted accelerant under my wife's car. That scene." The shorter officer took a step backward, his hand shaking as he reached for his radio. The fire had reached the engine compartment now, and thick black smoke billowed into the evening sky. The sound of approaching fire trucks added to the chaos of sirens, voices, and the crackling flames. Mrs. Thompson stood tall, her phone still recording as tears streamed down her face. Not from fear anymore, but from pure anger. "My whole life is in that car," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the noise. "Every contract, every invoice, every piece of proof that I built my business from nothing." The news camera swung to capture her words, broadcasting her pain to thousands of viewers. The fire department arrived with a screech of brakes, their red trucks casting more dancing lights across the scene. The two officers who had caused this disaster were now backing away, trying to blend into the growing crowd. But there was nowhere for them to hide. Too many cameras were recording their every move. Mrs. Thompson's husband wrapped an arm around her shoulders, providing silent support as they watched the firefighters work. The water from their hoses created steam as it hit the burning vehicle, adding to the surreal atmosphere of the scene. "I want to press charges," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice steady despite everything. "Destruction of property, harassment, abuse of power, everything." Her words carried the weight of someone who knew their rights and wasn't afraid to fight for them. The news reporter nodded approvingly, making sure her cameraman caught every word. A police supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing. The two officers who had started this whole mess stood straighter, but their faces showed they knew their careers might be going up in flames just like Mrs. Thompson's car. The supervisor's expression was thunderous as he took in the scene. The burning luxury car, the news crew, the crowd of witnesses with their phones raised. The night air was thick with smoke now, but something else was rising too. Hope. Hope that justice would be served, that change would come, that this incident would force people to acknowledge the reality of police harassment in their community. As Mrs. Thompson watched her car burn, she made a silent promise to herself. This wouldn't be the end of her story. It would be the beginning of something much bigger. The supervisor, a gray-haired veteran with serious eyes, took one look at the burning Mercedes and immediately turned to the two officers. "Body cameras," he demanded, his voice carrying years of authority. "Both of you, right now." The officers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances that spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the firefighters were making progress with the flames, but the damage was already devastating. Mrs. Thompson watched as water streamed down the sides of her once pristine vehicle, now a blackened shell of metal. The stack of business documents inside was surely destroyed. Years of careful record-keeping reduced to ashes. "Chief," her husband called out to the supervisor, his lawyer's briefcase now in hand. "We have video evidence of your officers planting an accelerant under my wife's vehicle." The news reporter edged closer, her microphone extended to catch every word. The two guilty officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "He reached under the driver's seat," Mrs. Thompson added, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "I saw him do it. It's all recorded on my phone." She held up her device, still faithfully capturing everything. The shorter officer's face went pale as a sheet. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with more neighbors joining every minute. Phones were raised everywhere, recording the scene from dozens of angles. Some people were already posting live on social media, ensuring this incident couldn't be swept under the rug. "Both of you in my car." "Now," the supervisor ordered the officers, his face tight with controlled anger. As they walked away, shoulders slumped, he turned to Mrs. Thompson and her husband. "I want to see that video evidence," he said firmly but respectfully. "And I'd assure you, this will be thoroughly investigated." The fire was mostly out now, leaving behind the acrid smell of burnt metal and plastic. A firefighter approached, shaking his head. "Ma'am," he called to Mrs. Thompson, "we found something you should see." In his gloved hand was a partially melted container, the kind used to carry gasoline. The news reporter's eyes widened. "Can you confirm that this container was planted by the officers?" she asked, her microphone extended. The firefighter looked at the supervisor, who nodded grimly. This was going to be impossible to cover up. Mrs. Thompson's husband was already on his phone, talking rapidly to colleagues at his law firm. "We're filing first thing in the morning," he said between calls. "Civil rights violation, destruction of property, harassment, everything." His wife stood beside him, her back straight despite the weight of what had happened. The night air was cooling, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension. More police cars had arrived, along with internal affairs investigators who began taking statements from witnesses. The news crew was preparing for another live broadcast, ensuring the story would lead the evening news. "Those were my tax documents," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, watching as firefighters searched through the wreckage of her car. "Proof of every sale, every transaction." They knew exactly what they were doing. Her words carried the weight of understanding. This hadn't been random harassment. They had targeted her specifically, a successful black business owner in an upscale neighborhood. The supervisor was reviewing the body camera footage on a tablet, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, shaking his head. He looked up at Mrs. Thompson and her husband. "I'm placing both officers on immediate administrative leave. Will cooperate fully with any investigation." From the supervisor's car came the sound of heated arguments as the two officers realized the gravity of their situation. Their careers were likely over, but more importantly, they had exposed a deep-rooted problem that could no longer be ignored. Mrs. Thompson squared her shoulders, drawing strength from the support around her. The destruction of her car and business records was devastating, but something more important was emerging from the ashes, a chance for real change, an opportunity to challenge the system that had allowed this to happen. The internal affairs team arrived in unmarked cars, their presence adding another layer of seriousness to the scene. Mrs. Thompson's husband had just finished making calls to his network of civil rights attorneys, and now 6 of the city's top lawyers were on their way. The 2 officers who had started this mess sat in the supervisor's car, their faces ashen as they realized the full consequences of their actions. "We've reviewed the initial body camera footage," the lead internal affairs investigator announced, her expression grim. She was a no-nonsense woman with quick eyes that missed nothing. "What we've seen is disturbing." She turned to the supervisor. "Those officers need to be taken to headquarters immediately." The news crew was broadcasting live again. "We're standing at what appears to be one of the most blatant cases of police misconduct this city has seen," the reporter stated into her microphone. "Behind me, you can see the remains of a successful business owner's vehicle, deliberately destroyed by officers who are supposed to protect and serve." Mrs. Thompson's phone had been buzzing nonstop. Other business owners from her community were calling, texting, offering support. Some were already organizing a fundraiser to help replace her destroyed documents and vehicle. The outpouring of support brought fresh tears to her eyes, but these were different from before. These were tears of gratitude. "Ma'am," called one of the firefighters, approaching with a partially salvaged leather portfolio. "We managed to save some of your papers. They're damaged, but maybe something can be recovered." Mrs. Thompson took the wet, smoke-stained portfolio with trembling hands. Inside, she could make out fragments of contracts, invoices, and business licenses, proof of everything she'd built. Her husband was deep in conversation with the internal affairs investigator, his legal expertise evident in every word. "We have multiple video angles," he explained, "from my wife's phone, body cameras, neighbors' phones, and the news crew. There's no way to deny what happened here." The 2 officers were finally being transferred to separate police cars. As they were led past Mrs. Thompson, the taller one couldn't meet her eyes. The shorter one, however, looked directly at her with an expression that mixed shame with something else. Perhaps the realization that his actions had just sparked something much bigger than he'd intended. "We've received calls from 3 national news networks," the local reporter said, stepping away from her camera. "They want to run this story tomorrow morning." This is going viral. Mrs. Thompson nodded, understanding that her personal tragedy was becoming a symbol of a larger struggle. More community members had gathered, forming a supportive circle around Mrs. Thompson and her husband. Among them were other business owners, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who'd had enough of watching their neighbors face harassment. The department will cover all damages, the supervisor announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. But I know that doesn't make up for what happened here. He paused, looking at the destroyed Mercedes. We're also launching a full investigation into both officers' previous arrests and traffic stops. This might not be the first time. Mrs. Thompson's husband received another call, this time from a national civil rights organization. They wanted to use this incident as a catalyst for police reform in departments across the country. As he discussed details, Mrs. Thompson stood tall, watching the tow truck prepare to take away her ruined car. "Don't let them intimidate you," an elderly neighbor called out, her voice carrying years of wisdom. "You stand your ground." Others nodded in agreement, and Mrs. Thompson felt strength flowing from their support. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever faced similar treatment, but didn't have witnesses or cameras present. The night was growing late, but nobody was leaving. This moment felt too important, too pivotal to walk away from. As the tow truck's lights flashed and the news crews prepared for another update, Mrs. Thompson realized that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most important changes. Her voice would be heard, and her story would help ensure this never happened to anyone else. The following morning, the story exploded across every major news network. Mrs. Thompson's living room had become a makeshift headquarters, with phones ringing constantly and supporters arriving with coffee and encouragement. Her husband sat at their dining table, surrounded by a team of civil rights attorneys who'd been working through the night. "The body camera footage is damning," one lawyer announced, looking up from his laptop. "We can clearly see Officer Hansen reaching under the car, and Officer Burke standing guard. There's no way they can explain this away." The footage had already been viewed millions of times online, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with another message, this time from her employees at the boutique. They'd organized a volunteer team to help recreate the destroyed business records, working from backed-up emails and bank statements. The community's response had been overwhelming, proving that love could emerge from even the darkest situations. "We found a pattern," another attorney called out, shuffling through papers. 7 other business owners in the area reported similar harassment from these officers, but none had video evidence like we do. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill. How many others had suffered in silence? The doorbell rang again. This time, it was the local Chamber of Commerce president, carrying a stack of documents. "We've got copies of all your business licenses and permits from our files," she announced. "And the whole business community stands behind you." What these officers did, it stops now. News vans still lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. The morning shows had been running the story nonstop, showing the shocking footage of officers deliberately destroying a successful black business owner's property. The response had been unanimous. This was unacceptable. Internal Affairs just called. Mrs. Thompson's husband announced, hanging up his phone. "They've suspended 3 more officers who knew about similar incidents but stayed quiet. The whole department is being investigated." His wife nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. The system needed this shakeup, but it hurt to see how deep the problems went. The insurance adjuster arrived next, clipboard in hand. But instead of the usual bureaucratic process, he seemed genuinely moved by the situation. "We're expediting everything," he explained, taking photos of the evidence. "And we're counting those destroyed business documents as part of the loss. We'll make this right." Mrs. Thompson sat down heavily on her couch, exhausted but determined. Her daughter had just left for school, wearing a t-shirt that read, "My mom stands for justice." The support was touching, but the weight of responsibility felt heavy. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who'd ever faced discrimination but couldn't prove it. The police chief is holding a press conference at noon, someone called out. Word is, they're announcing major policy changes. The room buzzed with excitement. Change was happening, faster than anyone had expected. The power of video evidence, social media, and community support had created unstoppable momentum. Outside, supporters had started gathering again. They carried signs expressing solidarity and demanding justice. But these weren't angry protesters. They were business owners, teachers, doctors, lawyers, all standing together to say enough is enough. The sight brought fresh tears to Mrs. Thompson's eyes. Her phone lit up with another message. The district attorney wanted to meet. This was no longer just a civil matter. Criminal charges were being considered. The two officers who destroyed her car had started something they couldn't finish, unleashed a wave of change they never saw coming. We're trending nationwide, one of the younger lawyers announced, checking social media. Hashtag justice for business owners and hashtag stop police harassment are at the top of every platform. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't focused on the hashtags or the viral videos. She was thinking about the future, about making sure her daughter would never have to face what she had faced. The morning light streamed through her windows, catching the smoke damage on her clothes from the night before. But instead of reminding her of what she'd lost, it reminded her of what she was gaining. A chance to make real change, to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for justice. By noon, the police chief's press conference had become the most watched local broadcast in years. Standing at the podium, his face grave, he addressed not just the reporters, but the entire community watching at home. What happened last night was not just a failure of two officers, he announced. It was a failure of the entire system, and that stops today. Mrs. Thompson watched from her living room, surrounded by supporters and legal advisors. The chief continued, outlining immediate changes: mandatory bias training, new oversight committees, body camera reviews, and most importantly, a complete investigation into past complaints against the department. Both officers have been terminated, the chief announced, his words sending ripples through the crowd. And we're cooperating fully with the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Police officers being held accountable. It felt like a turning point. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Thompson's boutique, customers were pouring in. They came not just to shop, but to show support. A line stretched around the block, with people buying gift cards and leaving encouraging messages. Her employees had set up a donation box for a local civil rights organization, which was already overflowing. The insurance company called again, her husband said, walking into the room with more papers. They're not just replacing your car, they're upgrading it. They want to make a statement about standing against injustice. Mrs. Thompson nodded, touched by how many people and organizations were stepping up. The district attorney arrived at their house personally, a folder thick with documents under her arm. We're charging both officers, she announced without preamble. Destruction of property, abuse of power, filing false reports, everything we can make stick. Her expression softened. Your courage in standing up to them. It's giving others the strength to come forward. Social media was still buzzing with the story. Videos of the incident had been viewed tens of millions of times, sparking discussions about police reform across the country. But what touched Mrs. Thompson most were the messages from other business owners who'd faced similar harassment but had been afraid to speak up. Look at this, one of the lawyers called out, showing his tablet. Other police departments around the country were announcing their own reforms, trying to get ahead of the wave of change. The incident had become a catalyst, forcing conversations that were long overdue. The two former officers had gone silent, their lawyers advising them to avoid public statements. But their body camera footage told the whole story, the casual way they'd planned the destruction, never imagining they'd be caught. It was evidence not just of their crime, but of a mindset that needed to change. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with another message, this time from a national business magazine. They wanted to feature her in their next issue, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and change. From ashes to action. How one business owner's tragedy sparked national reform, the proposed headline read. Outside, the community continued to rally. Local businesses had organized a fundraiser to help others who'd faced similar harassment but couldn't prove it. Churches, community centers, and civic groups were holding meetings to discuss how to prevent such incidents in the future. Mom. Her daughter called from the doorway, home from school. My teacher used your story in class today. She said you're showing us all how to stand up for what's right. Mrs. Thompson hugged her daughter tight, realizing that perhaps this was the most important outcome, showing the next generation that change was possible. The sun was setting again, marking 24 hours since the incident that had changed everything. But unlike the previous evening's darkness and fear, this sunset felt like a beginning. The destroyed car and burned papers had become powerful symbols of resistance and reform. We're not done, Mrs. Thompson announced to the room full of supporters. This isn't just about me or what happened last night. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone else. The others nodded, understanding that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement toward real, lasting change. 1 month later, Mrs. Thompson stood at a podium in front of City Hall, addressing a crowd that stretched as far as she could see. Her story had sparked a movement that nobody could have predicted that frightening night when her car burned. Behind her sat city officials, community leaders, and her proud family, all gathered for a historic moment. Today, we're not just signing new police reform laws, she began, her voice strong and clear. We're changing the way our community works together. The crowd cheered as she held up the document that would become known as the Business Owners Protection Act, ensuring that no entrepreneur would face harassment or discrimination from law enforcement. Her boutique had become a symbol of resilience. The previously destroyed business records had been fully restored thanks to community effort, and her new luxury car sat proudly in the parking lot, wrapped with a message of unity and change. But more importantly, her story had opened doors that had been locked for too long. The 2 former officers had pleaded guilty to all charges. Their sentencing hearing was scheduled for next week, but that wasn't what mattered most to Mrs. Thompson. What mattered was the change their actions had accidentally sparked. 17 other police departments across the country had adopted similar reforms, with more following every week. The business community stands united, the Chamber of Commerce president announced, stepping up to the podium. We've created a rapid response team to support any entrepreneur who faces discrimination. The fund they'd established had already helped 3 other business owners who'd come forward with similar stories. Mrs. Thompson's husband stood next, his legal expertise having helped craft the new legislation. This law isn't just about punishment, he explained. It's about prevention, education, and building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The police chief nodded in agreement from his seat on the stage. The crowd included faces from every part of the community: business owners, police officers, teachers, students, and families. They weren't divided by anger anymore, but united in purpose. Even some of the officers who'd initially resisted change had become advocates for reform after seeing the positive impact. My mom taught me something important, Mrs. Thompson's daughter told a reporter covering the event. She showed me that one person standing up for what's right can change everything. The young girl's words would later become the title of a documentary about the incident and its aftermath. The insurance company had made good on their promise, replacing not just the car, but helping to establish a business recovery program for similar cases. Other companies followed their lead, creating a network of support that stretched across the state. What had started as one woman's tragedy had become a blueprint for positive change. The hardest part wasn't losing my car or my papers. Mrs. Thompson continued at the podium. It was knowing that this had happened to others who couldn't fight back. But today, that changes. She signed the new law with a flourish, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Her boutique had doubled in size, becoming not just a fashion destination, but a meeting place for community leaders and activists. The wall behind her register displayed framed news articles about the incident, serving as a reminder that positive change was possible, even from the darkest moments. "This isn't the end," she concluded, looking out over the sea of faces. "It's just the beginning. We've shown what's possible when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, when we turn anger into action and fear into hope." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing off the City Hall columns. As she stepped back from the podium, Mrs. Thompson felt tears in her eyes again. But these weren't tears of fear or frustration like that night a month ago. These were tears of joy, of accomplishment, of knowing that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the best changes, if you were brave enough to stand your ground and fight for what was right. The sun shone brightly overhead, a perfect day for new beginnings. In the end, those two officers hadn't destroyed her business or her spirit. They'd accidentally helped create something much bigger than themselves. They'd helped spark a movement that would ensure no one else would have to face what she did that dark night when her car burned and her community rose up to say, "Enough is enough."